welcome to Dialogue. Despite facing numerous challenges and uncertainties, China has reiterated its commitment to opening up, regardless of any changes that may occur in the external world. With the post-pandemic era upon us, how can the East and West collaborate more effectively after the Ukraine crisis? What other factors will shape the relationship between the EU and China? To find out more, I'm happy to talk with Danilo Türk, former President of Slovenia. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue, Mr. Türk. We have this pandemic behind us, and we talking about the recovery of economy, recovery of everything basically. Then Asia and Europe, the recovery of ties, economic ties, diplomatic ties. That's the same, I would say, between China and the EU. So, in what way can we recover, diplomatic ties, economic ties in every aspect, maybe?
Well, the ending of COVID-19 pandemic is not the only factor that defines our moment today. And I believe that we need really very serious and long-term thinking. Serious and long-term thinking both in China and in the European Union. It is very easy to decide under the pressure of events like the war in Ukraine. And sometimes it seems that the automaticity of decision-making, particularly in the European Union, happens at the expense of more profound thinking and profound understanding of a long-term need for good relations and cooperation between European Union and China. So I'm in fact quite worried that the current flurry of activities, events that follow very quickly, will overshadow the necessary reflection. We would really need very serious reflection on how we manage, how we organize the relations between European Union and China for the long-term future. And I'm afraid that in European Union we do not have enough of that reflection and enough of deep thinking about our future.
Mm-hmm. Speak of that, economic relationship is an important part of the bilateral ties. The Chinese ambassador to the European Union talked about this suspended investment treaty between the two sides.
Yes.
He suggested that we might implement partially, yes, if not completely, because part of that obviously is beneficial to the European Union and also beneficial to China.
Well, we must not forget that the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment was initiated by European Union years ago. I think 8 or 9 years ago. It was European Union that proposed a conclusion of an investment treaty, which would be a comprehensive agreement on investment. Then, for political reasons, that was suspended. I mean, the agreement was signed but was not ratified, and I believe that that's a pity. However, we are now in a new situation. In every respect, we are in a new situation. Post-COVID, war in Ukraine, I mean, there are many factors which have to be taken into account. So I believe that while it would be quite good if partial implementation of the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment could take place, we would also need a more serious discussion about long-term future. Maybe the Comprehensive Investment Agreement is not enough. Maybe we need a different model. But we have to think, really. I mean, I'm afraid of decision-making without thinking. And I think that right now we need a lot of thinking and decision-making that is really very well thought through. That's why revisiting of the Comprehensive Investment Agreement would require, serious work. You can't do it kind of automatically overnight. You can perhaps implement parts of it which are adequate for today's needs, but we also need to define our relations for the future in new ways, and that, of course, would require some time and some really serious work.
Mm-hmm. Well, you are in China, you witnessed, or you sensed this enthusiasm from the Chinese government side, from the business community, as the reopening is going ahead, the enthusiasm to recover for the economy and to open the country and welcome investment from European Union, from other parts of the world. So like people would imagine or would assume that would deepening economic ties between the two sides or more investment mutually. But how likely is that?
Well, look, I think that one important factor we have to keep in mind is the fact that right now around 70% of global growth happens in Asia. The largest part of that growth is dependent on China, on growth in China, which is promised to be fairly good this year, and in growth of China and partners in Asia, Chinese partners in Asia. So just imagine the European perspective of this. 75% of growth this year is actually dependent on Asia. So European Union should pay really great attention to what is happening in Asia and figure out how it wants to connect with Asia, because Asia will have a very important, perhaps decisive role in the evolution of global economy in the coming years. And it's important that European Union defines its relationship with Asia, and that means to a large extent China, in a way which would allow European Union to have the best possible position for the future. I believe that European Union could be, if I may put it slightly more metaphorically, a kind of a bridge between United States and Asia, United States and China. And that's something worth really serious thought. And I believe that we still have to do all the thinking that is necessary in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of the economic ties between the two sides, before her visit to China, Ursula von der Leyen talked about European Union's China policy, at least from her perspective. She talked about, in a sense, restricting trade in the tech sector, in particular high-tech sector. She talked about basically reducing, using her words, probably reliance or import of raw material from China. She's concerned with so-called over-dependence. And things like this, she used a word like that's for the purpose of de-risking for the European Union, but others are suspecting that's more like decoupling from China, the kind of similar to what to the U.S. trade policy toward China. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, I would caution against terminology which doesn't have really well thought through meaning. You see, to say de-risking, decoupling, these are terms, these are words which are not necessarily very well thought through. Coupling and decoupling is a process, and it has been happening for many years. I mean, there was certain areas in which coupling was taking place and decoupling also. So this is not entirely new. And of course, we have to define our future relationship for the mutual benefit, for the benefit of China, for the benefit of European Union. And we have to be worried about the use of terminology which actually stimulates a kind of an irrational fear, de-risking. Well, I'm not sure that China is presenting a big risk for European Union. I remember not long time ago, the whole work and cooperation in the high-tech field was seen as mutually beneficial. Now, all of a sudden, people start talking about risks. What has happened? I believe that this is, to a large extent, an irrational use of terminology which may have harmful effects. So I would caution against the use of such words as de-risking and similar, because I do believe that we need really a very good definition of mutual interest. And again, I believe that European Union should look for a role which would be a role of its own, not somebody else's defined role for the European Union. And of course, the key guiding principles, in my opinion, should be mutual interest. There are interests on the side of China, on the side of European Union, which can be seen as mutual. We have to find them, we have to define them, and we have to work within them.
I think the background for that sort of is like the U.S. is competing with China, using the words, their own words, like competition with China geopolitically, because people say they are two superpowers. The U.S. is worried about being replaced by China as the most prominent country in the world. But for China-European Union relationship, they are not competing geopolitically. They are mostly cooperating with each other in a mutually beneficial way.
I hope so, and I hope that this will prevail. I mean, European Union shouldn't blindly follow whatever is daily politics in United States of America. European Union must have its own interests. Those interests may be in many respects similar to those of the United States, but they are not identical. They are European, and we have to be really very precise in our own definition of European interests in this context. But then when it comes to the larger picture, to the global picture of global relations between United States and China as the two most powerful players in the world today, we also need progress. I would call that progress that is needed in the US-China relations some kind of managed competition. You know, competition is natural. I mean, I am not against competition at all. Competition is natural, but it has to be managed. Even in economy, we have rules of competition. You know? We don't compete blindly or without limits. In economy, there are rules that guarantee fair competition. Now, we need, also in geopolitics, we need rules. Of course, they are not going to be the same rules as in the field of economic cooperation, but they will have to be rules. Now, how does one come to that? I think the first thing to do now, at the global level, is to define the agenda where our common needs to cooperate outweigh whatever competing interests may we otherwise have. So, for example, on the issues of global warming, on the issue of financial stability, on the issue of global financial stability, I think the interests are so common that we have to make sure that nothing that happens in the area of competition would harm global financial stability, for example. Then there is a need to figure out how to improve things in the more regional context, such as, for example, just one example, the Code of Conduct for South China Sea. And then I think in a more longer term, we need also to figure out how to establish new rules for nuclear weapons to control and reduce nuclear weapons. You know? We don't have that discussion right now. We don't see that discussion right now. And obviously, what I'm trying to say is simply that competition also requires rules, and it is never completely divorced, delinked from cooperation. So competition and cooperation are close relatives. You never compete totally, or you never cooperate totally. You always have competition and some degree of cooperation. And in order to have a productive competition and productive cooperation, you need an agenda. And that agenda is necessary in order to establish clearer rules, which will govern the competition and which will also guide cooperation.
Let's have a short break. We'll be right back after this. Well, China is, with the reopening, is poised to re-engage with the rest of the world. And then on the part of that could be the resumption or continuation of the Belt and Road Initiative. And recently, the Malaysian Prime Minister has called on China to regain momentum on BRI projects, saying that in the development program best exemplifies solidarity and cooperation between countries in Asia. What do you make of his remarks?
Yeah, I think that these are very interesting and wise remarks. I think that, you see, now at the time of the 10th anniversary of Belt and Road Initiative, it's necessary to think about a new level, new quality of Belt and Road Initiative, because it all started with investment in infrastructure. And that's fundamental. I think that also in the Chinese tradition there is a saying that if you want to build a house, you first have to build a road. So it's quite useful that the first emphasis was on infrastructure. But then, again, it would be very interesting to see what happens in the next 10 years. Of course, infrastructure projects will have to continue. There will be additional infrastructural projects, and all that is good. But you would need other aspects as well. And let me give you an example, which I believe will be important in the coming years, and that is industrial development in Africa. Now, Belt and Road Initiative has already produced effects. I mean, there are like 50 countries out of 54 African countries that have Belt and Road agreements with China. All right, there are several industrial zones established in Africa on that basis. The question is, what happens next? What happens in the next 10 years? Because Africa will need industrial phase in its future development. Now, that industrial phase would ideally be guided by the policy making of Africa itself, by the African Union, which is now establishing a common customs space in Africa. And that, of course, should help trade within Africa, but also would help to those investors who would invest in industrial and other facilities for the future of Africa. I would be very interested to see if Africa could invite, in the phase 2 of Belt and Road process, China and European Union to focus on certain chosen projects of Africa itself. You see, Belt and Road Initiative is not against anybody. Belt and Road Initiative is in favor of partners. And if that is the case, then there should be space for, let's say, trilateral projects. No? Africa in the driving seat, China as the energetic investor, European Union as a traditional partner of Africa, and one which is constantly reviewing and adapting its forms of cooperation. I would like to see this kind of dynamic happening in the second phase of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I hope that something like that would come in due course. It's not now, of course, but let us start thinking about it.
Yeah, some of the practice probably is already happening in a sense. For example, Spanish Prime Minister mentioned about Chinese companies, Spanish companies cooperation in Latin America, given their cultural language connection. So it's easier, and the Chinese company can obviously seek help from the Spanish partners.
Sure.
Yeah, to invest.
Yeah, you can have a trilateral relationship in the Ibero-American context. Surely, I think that that's a very smart way of doing it, because Spain is present in Latin America economically, in addition to being culturally and historically present. But I mean, it would be really very interesting to see if Latin American countries can benefit from cooperation of Spain and China. That would be a new quality of development which should be supported, and could be a model that can be emulated in different ways by others as well. I mean, China is not isolating itself from other partners who are also working in Latin America. It would be interesting to see how these visions can converge. Can those visions converge? Spain has centuries of experience in Latin America. China is more new, but it's very important. It's a partner number one for many countries in Latin America. And obviously this is a very interesting and very promising approach.
Yeah, and mutually beneficial, obviously. And you mentioned about that China is not isolating anyone. China is opening basically to embrace any partnership if there is a will. And partly because there is a lack of understanding of China sometimes because of language, because of the different political systems, etc. And now China is also embarking on a path to modernization. They call it like a Chinese modernization. The stress is on its Chineseness. For example, this is modernization for a large population, the size of 1.4 billion people. It's a modernization of common prosperity. The emphasis is on narrowing the gap between rich and poor. What's your understanding of the Chinese modernization?
Well, the first thing is to understand that Chinese modernization will be Chinese. I mean, you can't import models of modernization. I mean, the growth of China in the past 30 years has been really typically Chinese. Nobody expected that this would happen. Nobody believed that this could happen. But, it happened. And it happened because China is China. And now the next phase, or in the next years, modernization will continue in the Chinese fashion. What I find fascinating is that the comprehensiveness of this idea of modernization has grown. China has been speaking for a number of years now about technological evolution, high-tech development in China. And now we see these other aspects being also emphasized in the 20th Congress of the CPC and in the two sessions, as you said, common prosperity for all. And that I find a very interesting dimension. And I'm very curious how this will go, because you see, China has an aging population. And Europe also has an aging population. So we understand a little bit what that brings, because an aging population requires new types of attention to the elderly and new types of work with the younger generation. So you have to manage these intergenerational dimensions in new ways, and that will have to be there. One thing is, of course, to reduce the social differentiation, rich and poor. And obviously, China will work in that regard, and this is its own priority, and we'll see how China does it. But in addition to that, it would be very interesting to see how the social policies of social development about the elderly, about young families, about making housing more affordable for young families, making migration less dramatic than it was in the recent past, when so many people moved to the big cities. Maybe now many of these people will move again away from bigger cities. We see these sort of things in Europe also. But of course, we see the phenomenon, but the approach, the policy cannot be the same everywhere. And of course, China is a very big country with a big population. It would be very interesting as a place where these policies of social development, the common prosperity policies, are put in place. So we will be looking at that with very great interest.
Mm-hmm. But of course, speak of external relationship from the Chinese side. One of the challenges is the relationship with the United States. People are talking about the U.S. launching, a containment policy or a new Cold War against China. What's the prospect for next, next year or next 5 years?
Yeah, this is difficult to say, because we see in the United States a kind of a piling up of terminology which is really quite harmful. It is a kind of a terminology of a quasi-Cold War, and that's not good. I mean, who needs enemies? I mean, there is no inevitability in, China and United States being enemies. They have to figure out how they would co-evolve, co-evolution. I remember a book by Henry Kissinger on China, which was published I believe 20 years ago or so. And in that book, not 10 years ago, Henry Kissinger concludes that what is needed is co-evolution. Now, that means that China will evolve in its own way, and the United States will evolve in its own way, but they will find also models that would allow them to evolve in a manner that doesn't produce conflicts. Now, I don't think that we are very successful. I mean, that China and the United States are very successful about that. Earlier on, I spoke about the need for an agenda where cooperation becomes priority number one. Global warming, financial stability, nuclear arms, and all that. So, one would need to place greater emphasis on that side of common agenda of cooperation, instead of piling up terminology and language that really only adds to acrimony and the feeling of inevitable conflict. I think that's really very bad, and that's not very wise policy to stimulate or to allow such language dimension to prevail, such language practice to prevail. If you look at the media in the United States, there is a lot of acrimonious language, a lot of language which kind of predicts some inevitable conflicts in the future, and that's not good. So, in short, I think that there is a need for revisiting all this and finding better ways, and above all, to define an agenda of cooperation.
Well, you are in Asia, you have met Asian leaders, Asian politicians. Obviously, for Asian countries, it seems like their priority remains development, growth, cooperation, and they are not, let's say, welcoming any kind of Cold War or confrontation.
No, clearly not. And you see, I also follow the activities in the United Nations carefully. I have worked for many years in the United Nations, and I'm worried to see that in the United Nations there is less talk about development than there should be. You see, United Nations is a universal, open organization. It's an organization which is open to everybody. So it should reflect the views of everybody in the world as a whole. And there, I think the level of priority that is given to development is not adequate today. We need to spend much more time talking about development and figuring out how to solve the critical problems, including, for example, the problem of debt burden, especially for low-income countries, who are going to suffer immensely if proper solutions are not found in the future. So development really should be much higher up on the agenda. Now, at a time when you have this prevalence of Cold War talk in the United States and really quite unwise talk within the European Union on the kind of de-risking, decoupling, this, that, we really need a fresh look and say, okay, well, let's stop here and let's try to figure out what would help everybody, what kind of an agenda we need, what kind of development we need. And here I think the Asian leaders can be really very helpful. And not only China, but everywhere in Asia, as you said.
The Singaporean Prime Minister also talked about...
Yeah, sure. I mean, that should kind of gain much more importance. That should be the dominant talk in the United Nations. That should be the dominant talk of the world.
Thank you, Mr. Türk. Thank you for speaking with us.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to Mr. Türk. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Xinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.